Vivek, I'm excited for this interview. When I first started interviewing people, you were one of the first people that I thought of who I wanted to interview. And for a number of reasons, we waited a while to do this. But I'm so looking forward to this. And first question I have for you, do you remember the first time that we met or talked? Because I think I remember, but I'm curious if you remember.
Interesting. I don't remember. First of all, so excited, have loved listening to these episodes. It's crazy. Our conversations now go back just about 15 years, which is pretty unbelievable. So I know we were, of course, in the same section in law school. I think the first time I saw you was on the basketball court, probably when you were sprinting right past me for a layup. But I don't think I remember the very first time that we met.
See, my memory is we were at a barbecue at Munger Hall, or the dorms there. And you came up to me and started talking to me about BYU football and Steve Young. And you knew a bunch about that. And I was so intrigued. And as I think back on that, it's like, oh, it's just like Vivek to be able to talk knowledgeably about something that I had experienced. And here you are, this Indian American from New York, Harvard, talking to me about BYU football. So anyway, that was, if that wasn't when we first met, that's at least a memory I have.
That's amazing. And I certainly remember as soon as I learned even just a little bit about your story. And of course, whatever I had heard about you was only scratching the surface in terms of the entire journey that you had been on. I'm always interested to learn more. And I always love, like so many Americans love sports, but it's funny. My wife sometimes jokes, I sometimes like reading and listening about sports more than I like watching. Of course, I love watching too, but it's always for me the story behind the story, the discipline it takes to get to the field. And I just, I could listen and hear about that for hours.
So yeah, curious, wanting to learn, certainly attributes that you possess. So what this episode's going to be a little bit different, and we're just going to kind of walk through your life. And I'm curious to learn more about your experiences, things you've learned from those experiences, because you've had some pretty unique ones. So let's go back to your childhood. Where did you grow up? What do you remember from your childhood? And what sort of maybe lessons or takeaways do you carry with you from that time period?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I will say, so I'm a middle kid. I have an older brother and a younger sister, and we all grew up in Long Island, New York, son of immigrant parents. So both immigrated from India. My dad came in 1972 when he was just about 22 or 23 years old. And he had finished medical school in India, and so came to be a doctor in the United States. And then he met and married my mom in 1980. It was arranged marriage. So they met, decided they liked each other, and got married 2 weeks later. And she came to the US a couple months later in the fall of 1980. And then we all grew up on Long Island. And, I just thinking when it comes to growing up, a couple things. I think first, of course, from parents learned, the value of high standards and working hard. But it's interesting because, I think, I ended up like my brother, my sister, and I all went to Harvard. And I think sometimes when people hear that, they think, well, the parents must have been really on you about everything. But it wasn't quite like that. It was much more, setting high standards. But really, it was about watching them. They're both doctors. They're both still practicing. My dad is just finished a term as president of the American Psychiatric Association. And so both really cared a lot about what they did. And I think without them ever having to say it, it was, hey, you should work really hard too. Hard work is important, but also think about, finding something that you really enjoy doing, something that really gets you going, and something hopefully that serves others as well. And so that was like a big part of them, and it really informed the steps that I took on my journey, because what I was interested in was in many ways so different from what they had done. They had done science and medicine. For me, it was history, philosophy, policy, politics. But I think watching them do what they did gave me the confidence, and they gave me the confidence to really figure out what I cared about and really to go after it. And so I would say growing up, a lot of time with family, a lot of time in the school and the community, but really a lot of focus on, history, politics, even from a young age, and the circumstances that allowed my parents to come to this country and be part of the American story, and what I could do about that. And then, of course, a lot of sports, basketball, running, and that was a running theme through all of it as well.
So many interesting things there, but the one that jumps out to me the most, because I just have no experience with this, is an arranged marriage. So interesting, an arranged marriage. Uh, at what point did you realize I actually have a knack for education, or maybe I'm a little more curious than some of my peers?
Interesting. Well, I would say, and it's always interesting because, when you like the thing that's not cool, you always have to worry, especially growing up, how that's going to play. And I would say for me, I always, always liked school, liked being around the people who I was with in school who also cared about school. But certainly when it came to a lot of the issues that I was interested in, you don't really think about the fact that, those interests are a little bit of an outlier for people your age. But I do remember it was right after, at the end, I think, of 10th grade. And I'd signed up for a summer program in US foreign policy at Georgetown University, a 3-week program, and had applied and, was really excited to go. And one of the teachers, we lived in an area that cared a lot about academics, which of course is a privilege when you're surrounded by people like that. And so sometimes actually for the teachers, there was much more of an ethic of, hey, don't go overboard with academics, because, you have to care about your mental health, which of course is also very important. But this teacher and one of my classmates said, yeah, for example, like look at Vivek, he's doing a US foreign policy course this summer. Shouldn't he be doing something more fun or something that's not just about the next run? And it was hard for me to explain to them that this was like exactly what I was doing. And, my dream was to work on policy, work in the White House, work on economic and foreign policy. And what's pretty cool is 20 years later, you never know how the breaks of life are going to take you, but not only was able to do those exact things, but a couple of at least one of the people who I met at that Georgetown summer program when we were 15, 16 years old, was a colleague of mine in the White House. He
All
was
right.
working at the White House counsel's office. And so it is pretty incredible to see how these threads come together. The professor from that summer foreign policy class, I'm still in touch with him 20 years later. I was able to give him a tour of the West Wing, just like I know you stopped by in that final year. And so there are, even though, even still hopefully consider myself still young, there are already these full circle moments of the things that I really care about.
I just cannot imagine, going to a several week program on foreign policy in between, 16 years old. I had other interests, but so interesting to hear what you were pursuing. Okay, so was Harvard always the goal, and or did you consider other schools?
So it was definitely the goal. And it's interesting because, as you get older, you realize there are so many universities out there and they're all great. And, especially the United States has such an incredible higher education system that I think, we have to recognize, even though there are issues that need to be addressed, it really is a crown jewel in terms of our national strength. And, that was something I picked up on a young age. But of course, Harvard always had this mystique. And my older brother ended up going there. And so, like a younger sibling, I think for a lot of us, a lot of the things that you do are based just on, what your brother is doing. And so he was into policy and politics and history. So was I. He was into baseball and then basketball and tennis. So was I. And of course, when he went to Harvard, I wanted to go too. And so, yeah, I remember senior year, that was where I wanted to go. I put in an early application and was so excited when I got accepted. And that was basically that.
Okay, so you go to Harvard, and this is a ridiculous question, bordering on almost stupid, but what was like one of the main takeaways from Harvard from that experience?
Yeah, I guess I would say really, that's a good question. It was, so maybe I would say three things on that. First is that, sometimes, and I know you and I have talked about this, there is a question of, what you want to do, what you want to study and where is it going to take you and trying to think about the path ahead. And of course, all those pressures are there in college because you're thinking about, well, what do I want to do after? But I did find for me a combination of, purposefulness, but also some luck that I was really able to take courses and study with professors where I was just really interested in the classes. And so it wasn't just let me do well in this class so this other great thing can happen down the road. I just really loved it for its own sake. And so I took Justice, which I know we've talked about, the course with
Yeah.
Michael
Profound.
Sandel.
Yep.
I actually just saw him speak a couple weeks ago. And again, 20 years later, it's pretty amazing. And then I was really into, I started off as a government major and took a lot of political science classes, but was really into history more than anything. And I loved history of the Cold War because it was something that was for the most part outside of my lifetime. I was born in 1987, but at the same time, it was recent enough where you almost felt like you could touch it. Some of the people were still alive. The professors teaching had lived through many of the events that they were teaching about. And so I thought that was super interesting. And I had one professor, his name was Ernest May, and he'd been on the Harvard faculty since the 1950s. And he ended up passing away right around the time when I graduated. But he was incredible. I just learned so much from him on how to think, how to construct historical arguments, how to check yourself and your own thinking. And I ended up taking 6 different classes with him.
Oh
And
my gosh.
so, yeah, he was really, the biggest influence academically. And so I think that was just, one big thing, finding something to be excited about. And that's not something that you can always plan for, but I was very lucky that I found that. I think the second thing is that I really felt that, even though, for a top ranked university like Harvard or Stanford, where we were, you have some of the most talented people in all of these different fields. But in many ways, it's still the same range of personalities and issues and challenges that anybody faces. And so while you think you go there to learn from quote unquote the best in whatever field that may be, and you do, and that's a big part of it. Some of it is also recognizing, yes, you've made it there. You're lucky to be there. You're lucky to be around the other people there. But you're also just learning from them the way you would in any community. The struggles that they're going through, the victories that they have. They're trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives, just like you. And so Harvard was very special in that everybody would eat, for the most part, on campus in the dining halls. And so you would see people multiple times a day. And so I think that was very special. And, still in touch with those folks, again, 15, 20 years after the fact. And then the third thing, which I've just been thinking about is I do feel when you're at that age and there's so much that you still have to learn, time in many ways seems like it slows down. And there's so much that fits into that less than 4-year period. Whereas now we're at the age where, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, it just goes by so quickly. And you're like, what did I even do, these last 2 years? And whereas you realize, in that 3 years and 9 months of the beginning to college to end, there's just so much packed in there, so many courses, so many experiences. And so I just think about how special of a time that was. And so I do think that a lot of times in my life, I'm sure for you as well, where you think, oh, I wish I had slowed down a little bit then and like enjoyed it. And I think for me, for college, not even because it necessarily led to anything, but because of its own sake, I really enjoyed being there and felt like if anything, of course, the FOMO is you only get to take, 30 or 32 courses when there were probably 100 or 150 that I would want to take.
So you did really well at Harvard too.
Yes, so I definitely, I got good grades in my history classes. Although I do remember my very first assignment came back with a B minus in my writing class, and so and it kind of reminded me of my very first math test in high school. I think it was right around that range. Might have been like in the high 70s or an 80, and so I remember getting that and, feeling bad about it, but just thinking, oh, this was what it was like in high school. And you kind of have to dig out of it. And it's interesting. This is not always the case, but because grading can be arbitrary, but turned out that professor for that writing class, he did grade, very hard, I think, from everything I could tell, but he also gave me some pretty basic tips about how to actually stitch paragraphs together and make an essay coherent. That wound up influencing my writing for the rest of college. And so, yeah, I took a lot of history, government classes, and then ended up writing my senior thesis on a guy named Elliot Richardson, who had passed away at the end of the 20th century, but was a very famous public servant and had this philosophy of moderate republicanism in the late 1970s. And so, yeah, wrote the senior thesis, got good grades in those classes. And I think that's what enabled me to be at Stanford Law School with you.
Okay, so you start, you're doing well at Harvard. You start thinking about next steps, graduate school, law school. Where was your mind at?
Yeah. So at that point, well, to make a very long story short, at one point, senior spring, I started thinking, I've been on this politics path, not for so long, because at that point I was only 21, but I started wondering, should I at least think about other paths? And my parents were doctors. And so I started actually looking at medicine. And so I had applied to law school at that point. And so secured a spot at Stanford. But as you know, Stanford, you can defer. And so I got a 1 year scholarship to study in England and to get a master's degree in history in England. And so that was fully covered. I knew that was a special opportunity because if I, part of me was restless and I wanted to do the next thing, but I knew that I would regret not taking that year and a chance to live overseas, which I had never done except for one summer when I was in college. And so I thought, let me put down this spot at law school, graduate, take a summer pre-medical course, go to England for the year, and then figure out what I want to do. And basically through that process, I realized between, shadowing at Mass General Hospital and taking that course, I like the idea of being a doctor and the service and the innovation that you can pursue. But I wasn't day to day. I knew that wasn't what was getting me the way that policy and history and politics did. But it was good to experience and, no regret in terms of trying out something new. And then when I was in England as well, that made me realize, I wrote another thesis there on Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was an incredible historian and had lived such an interesting life. And he had actually studied in England under the same fellowship after graduating from Harvard that I did in the late 1930s. And so that was a great experience, but it also made me realize, I love research, I love writing, but I realized in academia, the reward for finishing a research project is you get to start another research project. And I felt like that was so important. There were other things that I wanted to do as well. And that's really what got me to law school. I will say one thing, though, about that, just not really connected to anything specifically, but it reminded me. One of our classmates, who shall remain nameless, but I met him the first week of school. Interesting guy, interesting background. And he had some type of journalism background, which I love writing. I'm still a news junkie after all these years. Again, probably too much time. And so I asked him, well, why didn't you stay there in that job? Just curious because you're always interested in where people are coming from. And he said, I wanted to stop writing about other people doing things. And I just wanted to do things myself. And it was an interesting perspective, but the older I get, the more I really disagree with that perspective, because it is often the people who are writing things that the rest of us are reacting to. And it's the people, who are doing research, like, you and your colleagues do in academia that paved the way decades into the future, long after the day-to-day back and forth is done. And so to me, it doesn't mean that one is right or wrong. It just means that there are these different paths that are valuable. There's no one that is objectively better than other. It's more about, what is the right fit for you and where you want to contribute. And for me, I knew I always wanted to be around ideas and research and writing. But I thought rather than making a career out of doing that, I could take what I learned. I would be a lifelong learner in those fields and try to apply it to more of the day-to-day work of making good public policy.
I like your perspective on that. When I was at Stanford, I was in the office of one of the professors who I really admired. And I asked him, I said, are you ever going to write a book? And he said, no, I would rather do than write. And so kind of that same perspective, it was a little bit different because he would have been writing about himself. But I like your take on it. Okay, so uh, as you were thinking about law schools, did you always want, once you decided you wanted to go to law school, did you always want to attend Stanford or were you considering other schools?
No, absolutely not. I have family, cousins, aunt and uncle, who we're close with out in the Bay Area. And so we would come out to California to visit them. But beyond that, California was not on my radar screen. And so senior year of college, applied to Harvard Law School, was accepted. And that was when Barack Obama had just been elected. And so there was this sense, look at what you can do if you go to Harvard Law School, basically president of law review to the presidency. Of course, a lot of things that he did in between. But it was really because I was thinking through these alternate career paths. And, by that point, I knew I would defer at least for 1 year. And so it took the pressure off a little bit. And, I think, like I was saying before, I've really learned as I've gotten older, of course, different universities have different strengths. And, for example, if you really want to be in an urban environment, it might make more sense to go to a school in a city rather than a school like Stanford or Dartmouth. But beyond that, I've really come to believe that all these schools are good. And so a lot of the stress, I think, about choosing schools, I'm not suggesting that you pick it out of a hat, but I think some of it is not always necessary. And so that wasn't necessarily my thinking at the time, but I kind of backed into it because I was thinking, well, I'm going to Cambridge. Who even knows if I'm going to go to law school? I just have to put down the deposit. And so that kind of took the pressure off a little bit. And so I ended up, I'd also applied to Stanford and I ended up getting accepted. And I just thought, it's so funny how these things work. The admissions office for Stanford would cover part of your airfare if you came out for the weekend. And so, a couple $100, which is not insignificant, but in the grand scheme of life, of course, not a huge thing. Had they not done that, I would not have gone to the admitted students weekend, and I certainly would not have enrolled at Stanford. And it was after my senior thesis was handed in, and before the thesis is handed in, that's all you can do. And it turned out for Harvard Law School, of course, I was right there on the campus, but I never made it to their admitted students weekend because the first one, it's a bigger school, so they had two. The first one was before the thesis was due, so I was cranking away. And the second one was the same weekend as Stanford. And I thought, well, let me just go to California. I know I'm going to go to Harvard Law School. And then, of course, I came for that weekend and I just saw the campus and I just thought, this is so cool. It's so interesting. I just really like the atmosphere here. I loved all the workshops and I just imagined a different kind of life out there. And so I thought, well, I may not go to any of these places anyway. So let me put down the deposit at Stanford. And it was kind of tricky because I'd also applied to a public policy degree at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And so I was going to do Harvard Law School, Harvard Kennedy School, and they were going to align well. Now I was Stanford plus Kennedy School, which people have done, but it's kind of tricky to make it all work with the schedule. And then, of course, once I got to Stanford, I was able to do law school and business school, but then had to drop the Kennedy School degree. So it just shows, I think for me, you never know how these things are really going to work out. But, very happy with the decision that I made. And I will say the last thing is, a couple people in my class said, who are also applying to law school, and they'd also gotten into these places. They said, well, Stanford, that's so far away. Like, are you sure you want to be out there? And now actually a lot of those people actually live in California and live in San Francisco as well. So it shows you never know where anybody's going to be.
So did you plan on doing the business school as soon as you matriculated at Stanford?
So I think by the time I was getting ready to the summer before we all enrolled, I thought, let me just give this a shot. It probably will not work because I don't have any work experience, which is typically a key component of a business school application. But I was just wondering, Stanford, I think they have a public policy program, but they don't have a separate school the way Harvard does. And I was just imagining, I can do this. And now I know a couple of people who have, but the back and forth with the Kennedy School and the law school in particular is not easy. I think I only know one or two people who have done it. It turned out with the business school later, I found out there are a number of people who have done the back and forth. And so it is more workable. And so I think that summer before we started, I just studied for the GRE and I took the GRE, which isn't accepted by business schools in addition to the GMAT, and thought, let me just have this score so that I can apply this fall and see how it goes. And so I ended up taking the test right before we got there and then doing the application essays actually while we were in our 1L fall, which was
Okay.
a little bit busy, but was able to get those finished. And those business school essays are more personal. They're about what your goals are, what motivates you. And so that's always tough. You're in the law library, you're surrounded by books on contracts and civil procedure, and you're trying to figure out who am I and, what do I want to accomplish? And so, but it was a very interesting and very good exercise.
Okay, so another really big question as you think back on your experience at, let's just start with Stanford Law. What did you take away from that?
Yeah, I would say so. Stanford, as a university and being there, was absolutely very happy both to experience something new generally, but just to be at such a special place. And I think for the law school also, it was just as it was built. Law school is always intense. There's always a lot of pressure, but it was a much more collegial environment than stories I'd heard about what law school can be. And so I really liked that. I would say the part that I liked less, which has not as much to do with Stanford and more about law school, is one, and these are not surprises. I knew them going in, but it's a different thing to actually experience it. It turned out to be a lot more narrow and technical than maybe I was hoping or expecting. And I think because I'd come out of a history program, and history involves research, writing, a lot of footnotes and citations, and that's a good description of law school as well. But history, the questions can be much more expansive. You generally get to choose them, and so I found it very mind expanding in that way. Law school, I think, was much more. You have to learn this and make sure you master that. And of course, once you master those, like any subject, that's when the big questions can come up. But I did find that it was a little bit of an awkward fit for me compared to college, where I think I slotted right in very well based on my interests. And so that took some time getting used to. I think the other thing about law school is in college, and also to a degree in business school, everybody's interested in related but different things. And I think in law school, you're often all taking the same courses. For people who are looking to clerk, they're going after a similar set of clerkships. And so it can encourage a little bit of a narrow vision in terms of how to move forward. And I think a lot of our friends were able to break out of that. And of course, some of them liked that. And then they should, of course, go for it. But that's where conversations with people like you and thinking about how you were thinking about the next several years were very helpful to me.
Interesting. Okay. And then the business school, what do you take away from that experience?
Yeah, so that was super interesting. And, like mentioned, people had come from, in some ways, there were a lot of people who had come from similar backgrounds. They'd been consultants and they'd been bankers or they'd been in private equity, but the range of things that they wanted to do going forward was pretty vast. Some people wanted to work in nonprofits, some wanted to go overseas, some wanted to work at big tech companies, some wanted to do their own startups. And so just watching how people navigated that. And the other thing I liked is that even though truly 99%, sometimes when you say 99%, you think, is it actually 99%? But in this case, it is. I think 99% of folks there, were not interested in the short term into going into any type of policy or government role. But at the same time, they really respected what I was interested in and what I cared about. And so they felt like they could learn from me, even though really I was the person who had so much to learn from them. And I really think, as entrepreneurship and technology has exploded even further over the last 10 or 12 years, it's been amazing to watch what all of them are doing. And I try to keep up with all of that and learn as much as I can, because it's, of course, very interesting, but also very relevant to the public policy work that I've been able to be a part of.
It is amazing. The older you get, the more your peers end up in the news, in the media, just in large part just because you're older, right?
Yeah.
But it is so funny. It's like I see a news release, so and so is in the presidential cabinet and they've been charged with this. And it's like, oh, that's my former flag football teammate. I remember that guy. I love that guy. It's like it is so fun to see as we get older, people, and I don't, in this case, it seemed like something was maybe politically motivated. I don't know that he necessarily did anything wrong. Um, though I'm sure we will have classmates that did and do things wrong. But that is a really fun aspect of it. Okay, so you've got your JD MBA, you've got your Harvard undergrad, you've got the master's from Cambridge. What is your next step?
Yeah, and so it's a good question. And I actually have a very good friend from business school who at that point, he told me, Vivek, you're the most accomplished person I know. who's never actually done anything. And so he's a good friend. He was messing with me, but there was this sense all this school. And, it's interesting because there's no right answer about whether to work first before grad school, go straight to grad school. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. And I think an advantage is to the extent I really liked school, and I did. And one other thing I should say about Stanford is, there's law school classes, business school classes, but I actually took a couple of classes in the political science department, which didn't count for credit because I could only get credit if it was in the law school or the business school because of my joint degree. But going back to the foreign policy experience, they were just interesting to me. And one of them was with Condoleezza Rice. And so I took her foreign policy seminar where she would read and grade our papers each week. And actually, speaking of falling out of the gate at the beginning of everything, I remember the first paper came back and it said, "This paper starts strong." This is in her handwriting, but seems to lose focus. And I remember thinking I need to step up my game over here. That was an amazing class. I ended up being one of the TAs for the class the next year where I could help grade the papers myself. And so, talking about that intersection between writing, academia, policy, it was amazing to learn from her and her experience as well, and still in touch with her in her office after all these years. And so that was really great. But then I graduated and then had a little bit of a false step where I had kind of felt, to my friend's point, I really need to get some work experience. And there's something to be said for just getting that first job and plowing through. But in my case, I started off at McKinsey, which a lot of my closest friends have worked at, or in some cases still work at. And to your point about us getting older, several of them are partners now. But it just turned out it was not the right fit for me at all. And so I knew that within the first couple of weeks. And so as soon as the first case, or they call it a study at McKinsey, wrapped, it was a difficult call because I thought, this is my first job and I'm going to just up and leave within a couple of months. But I think it was important, thinking about it. On the one hand, you want to be committed to whatever you're doing. And, we've talked before, you and I, about grit and what all the research shows, and not stop at the first obstacle. On the other hand, while there's no one path in life and it changes over time, we all have a sense of what we care about. And I just had the sense of this work is really hard. And, whatever it is I think I want to do, I'm not sure this right now is actually going to help me get there. And so, and once you come to that conclusion, even if it's an incredible place, incredible brand name, it's very hard to stay. And so I decided to wrap up, ended up, doing a brief internship with a startup at the time, Quora, that a friend of mine worked at, and then wound up at what was really an incredible place, Kleiner Perkins, which is the venture capital firm that John Doerr has been affiliated with for 40 years. And so that was the first job. I basically had to find it myself through people that I knew and prove myself in terms of what I could do to help them on their marketing team. But that was incredible to be there and see, all of the ideas and new technologies and people who would come around there. And by that point, I knew I wanted to go directly into policy. They say the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And I just thought, if this is something that I want to do, let me find a way to do it now. And so I joined Kleiner Perkins, with the mutual understanding that if and when Hilary Clinton ran for president, I would take off because I wanted to be a part of that. But even that 8 or 9 month experience when I was there was so special. I'm still in touch with all those folks. I actually stopped by Kleiner Perkins earlier this year. And I always get nostalgic. It's interesting because technology is so much about the future, but I loved Kleiner. They had so much history, and they were actually going through a tough time at the time that I was working there for a number of reasons. But the firm has really revitalized itself. And so it was fun to go back and talk with some of the people there about that experience.
Yeah, I remember the consulting. I remember Kleiner Perkins. And I remember talking to you about, the importance of staying in your lane, grit. But you should only, it's like you got to persist as long as your inner voice is telling you to persist. And there's a time to stay in the lane, there's a time to get out and get into a better lane, right? Okay,
Yes,
so
I don't know if it's Harry Truman, but there's one of those funny quotes, because there's the Winston Churchill inspiration, never give up, never, ever, ever. Although I think he has, at the end of that sentence, he has something about when you should give up. But I think it was Truman who said, try again, then quit. There's no use, after a certain while. And so ultimately, persistence is the right way to go. And I feel that, now having an 8-month-old, you start to think about what do you want to teach your kid. And it's often a good question when you think about what you want to teach your kid. You think, well, I should probably be embodying that value myself. And I think resilience, persistence is so important, but you do want to make sure that you are aimed at the right target. And
Yeah.
you know that target can change, but it's good to have a sense of at least what you care about in that moment and what's actually important to you.
Okay, so Hillary Clinton runs, and what happens next?
Yeah, so I joined the campaign, dream job on the policy team. It was the kind of thing I'd imagined wanting to do. Well, ultimately, I imagined wanting to go into government, and I just thought this would be an incredible way to get there while also being part of something important. And so, to give away the ending, she did not win that election, but still in touch with all those folks. Had three bosses on the campaign. One was Jake Sullivan, who served as the national security advisor in the Biden administration. I just caught up with him 2 weeks ago. He's really the gold standard for what a policy mind could be, and how to be smart, but apply your principles in the right way. Be a great staffer, be a great thinker, be open to changing your mind. All of that and a rigor that he brought to every policy question we all learned from him. And in addition, Ann O'Leary, who was one of the other senior policy advisors, she was an incredible mentor, especially on issues of kids and families and the issues that actually keep people up at night. And I ended up working for her again when I went to work in the governor's office for Governor Newsom. And then Maya Harris, actually the vice president's sister, was also a senior policy advisor, and she had an incredible career. And so you don't realize when you're there because you're just going through the day to day, but you learn from these incredible people. But I will say, as incredible as those folks were, you actually learn the most from your peers, the people around you. And it's like you were saying about our classmates from Stanford. Now all of those folks are doing incredible things. One is a congressman. Several of them were my colleagues in the White House, and it meant that when you called them, if you had a tough ask or if they had a tough ask, you're basically drawing on 10 years of trust. And that was a really special thing. And so it does show that, it's like the other thing I'll say is, and I thought of this because, it was also, to just fast forward, was also briefly for the last couple of months of this past election, moved over from the White House to the Harris campaign, which also ended in a loss. And I do remember my basketball coach told us, it was a cliche, but he said, you learn more from losing than you do from winning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly the case. And so you take all those experiences with you in everything that you do.
Okay, so you work for the Hillary campaign. You end up at Governor Brown's office.
Yes. And so there, after Hillary lost, I felt, the goal of all this, I wanted to be part of the campaign. It's so important, but it was really to work in the government. And so I'm certainly, now won't have the chance to work in a Clinton administration. And I don't really want to be in DC right now. And I thought it would be nice to go somewhere else. But I remembered that one of my, I think that's, of course, when you're a junior staffer on a campaign, a lot of what you do is logistics. And I scheduled a call with one of the senior advisors and Governor Brown's chief of staff. I think it had been a year earlier. And so I remembered, hey, I asked my boss, do you think you would write a note to Nancy McFadden, who was Governor Brown's chief of staff, about me? And so she did, and I ended up meeting them over Thanksgiving. And I just felt, I remember I was communicating with journalist James Fallows, who's in many ways my favorite journalist and writer, just incredible career. And, part of life, sometimes you get very lucky. You get to meet these people who you've admired so long. And so I met him, I think, right after the election. And he said, there's all these other options. I know things that you may be interested in pursuing, but Governor Brown is just there for a couple more years. He's lived a legendary life. He has such a unique outlook on politics. That's probably the place that you should go, because these other things will be there in the future, but he will not. And so I took that advice, went there, learned an incredible amount, both from Governor Brown and then from Nancy, who ended up passing away the following year from cancer in her 50s, but just an incredible person, the way she ran the office, an incredible education in California politics. And that's why after a year, I decided I'm going to take the plunge and be a candidate myself.
So what was that like being a candidate yourself?
It was pretty crazy, in part because, now when people ask me, do you have any advice? And the number one thing I say is start early, because I think I started 5 or 6 months before the election. And I knew that was just the way it was. It was going to be challenging. But, a friend of mine told me even people who seem like they come out of nowhere don't really come out of nowhere. They're usually laying the groundwork
Yeah.
for a long time. And it takes a lot to just get everything going. And this in particular was a statewide race for California state treasurer. But for me, there were two things that really got me going. One was I knew that these statewide positions are often seen as stepping stones, but I thought this is a really interesting role in its own right. They chair a bunch of the state's financing authorities. They also sit on the state's pension boards for CalPERS and CalSTRS, which are the biggest pension funds in the United States. And then they also issue a debt affordability report every year and manage the issuing of the state's bonds. And so there's a lot there that really bears on the state's economy. And I've always been interested in economic and fiscal issues, and had learned a lot from Governor Brown in terms of how to make the right decisions in those places. And so I felt, this is actually a job. In some ways, it shouldn't actually be an elected job, but given that it is, I think I could bring a lot to the table. And second, that was year 2018, where a lot of people were stepping up, given the reaction to Trump's election and what he was trying to do, who didn't necessarily come from a conventional background and hadn't necessarily been on a political ladder, but were raising their hands saying, I have a bunch of new ideas. I want to put them on the table. And so I just thought that was a good year to really try to be, even with an unconventional background, like push for the policies I believed in, put it in a narrative of change that was very active that year, and see where it would go.
And you ran a very creative campaign. Briefly describe what you did.
Yeah. And so I thought, so much of being a candidate is raising money, and you have to go into that eyes wide open. And when you are a candidate, every day you have to think, I'm going to win this thing, like an entrepreneur, right? Or like an underdog in a sports match. But before, I had to be honest with myself and said, this is very likely not going to result, I'm unlikely to be taking the oath as the treasurer next year. What do I want to do in this campaign where even if I don't win, I'm proud of the race I ran. The people who support me are proud that they were supporters of this race and they could feel good about it. And that I can take something from this race into what I do next. And so I thought, in addition to doing all the things that candidates do, I'm just going to start running on foot across the state of California. And so we charted a route, and it was important to us that it be through the Central Valley, because those are often the communities that are forgotten when it comes to discussions of key issues in the state. And so we started in Sacramento, went all the way down the Central Valley, and then crossed over into Los Angeles. This was over a period of months, and I had a two-person team of two of my close friends coming with me. And so one, it was just an incredible personal experience, because you never, you're out there, you never know who you're going to run into or the conversations that you have. And second, you end up meeting a lot of people who are activists or advocates in these cities. And when I wound up back in the governor's office the following year, I often had conversations with those very same people. They said, hey, I remember meeting you in Fresno, remembered we talked about this issue for my son or daughter with disabilities. And so that was really special. I will say that being a candidate, it's exhausting, it's tough. And one of the things I found most difficult was you have to not put yourself out there in the sense of wanting to contribute, but you have to put your own name out there, because if people don't know your name, then by definition, they're not going to vote for you because they don't know who you are. And so that, I think, is an adjustment from being a staffer, where it doesn't really matter whether the outside world knows anything about you. As long as your boss and your teammates and a core group of 10 or 20 or 30 people know and trust you, that's all that really matters. And then you're helping the governor or the president be successful. And in many ways, I found out through this process, I'm more of a natural fit for that. It doesn't mean that I'll never, ever be a candidate again. I think there's something special about talking with people directly and learning from them directly, whereas as a staffer, you're often on Microsoft Word or Excel and figuring out exactly the right policy. The other thing is I did enjoy being able to speak out on issues on my own, whereas when you're a staffer, you're always channeling the boss's priorities. But it turns out that if you pick good bosses, which I've been fortunate to have, with folks like Governor Newsom, and in the White House, that removes a lot of that tension. And so it was a special experience. I think in many ways, a lot of low points, but a lot of high points as a candidate. You're always going up and down, like being an entrepreneur. One high point was getting the endorsement of the San Jose Mercury News, one of the largest newspapers in the state. And it really crystallized in some ways better than I was often doing, why I was running and what I was trying to do and why I thought this was important. And then the other thing that happened, because you can never predict these things, is that I met then Lieutenant Governor Newsom actually on the campaign trail. And it was that connection that both persuaded me watching him speak. This is the guy I'm going to vote for. Like, he should be the next governor. And also, I want to work for him next year, which I ended up having the chance to do.
Interesting. So had you not run, maybe you don't end up working for Governor Newsom. So you work for Governor Newsom, and what was that like, and where did that lead?
Yeah, so that was incredible. He's an incredible person in ways that I didn't fully appreciate until I actually saw him speak and then got the chance to work with him. He's incredibly politically talented, and I think everyone recognizes that as a communicator. But I think what some people don't realize, unless they start to pay attention and actually listen to him, is just how policy driven he is and how much conviction he brings to the table, and how smart he is. He's dyslexic, and so he actually memorizes his speeches and all of his facts and figures. He almost never reads things off a page, which is the typical critique of politicians, that other people are just putting words in their mouth. And so it was incredible. And Governor Brown had done, quite an amazing job in terms of restoring the state's fiscal health. But like in so many things in politics and in life, it's like, well, what's next? And with Newsom, you see a commitment to a core set of making sure that all people can participate. And I talked about the Central Valley, and I know that's something that's so important to him. A focus on innovation, and we've continued to see incredible innovation in the state in new technologies and how the state's universities and schools can support that. And then finally, the biggest issue in the state in many ways is housing, and it's taken several years of chipping away. The state, he just signed and pushed for, as part of his budget this year, a huge reform that will make housing much easier to build. And these are things that don't happen in a day or a week or a month or even a year. It takes constant pressure over time. The philosopher Max Weber called it the slow boring of hard boards politics. It's not always glamorous, but he's shown he's really able to do that. And so I really enjoyed being part of that. I was part of the first two budgets in his administration. We expanded the state's earned income tax credit, including for parents with young kids. We put away money to save for a rainy day when the budget is in deficit, which the state has been able to draw on right now. And so it was really special for me to be part of it. And so I was the deputy budget director and then worked as a senior counselor across all economic issues. And that was also during COVID and everything dealing with that. And would have been happy to stay, but I always dreamed since I was young of working in the White House. And so after Biden won, I knew I wanted to get a chance to work there, and ended up finding a job on the National Economic Council, which coordinates economic policy for the president.
Okay, so now you're in DC, you're back on the East Coast, and this is where you end up, yeah, back in the White House. So what is that like?
Yes, it's very special. Well, I will say for the first 6 months, I did not set foot in the White House because of the pandemic, and so
Mm.
it was kind of crazy because it was all the pressure, which I now know comes with the territory of working in the White House, but not actually being in the White House. Instead, being in our house in Sacramento because my wife was finishing her medical training over there, and so even just I remember making 8 a.m. Team check-in phone call. I'd have to wake up before 5 a.m. and the days would be long. And so it was nice to actually get there to DC and actually see the West Wing and the Eisenhower building for the first time. And then ended up doing a year of back and forth between DC and Sacramento as my wife finished up her training. And then she moved in the summer of 2022. Had an incredible 2 years on the economic team. Another really great boss, Brian Deese, who taught me so much about how to function in that environment and how to get to the heart of an issue, and worked a lot on energy prices and especially gas prices which of course can be a very big issue. And when they shoot up, can be the biggest issue in American politics. And it was especially tricky because after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, oil and gas prices shot up. And so we were taking a number of steps to manage that. And so it was a mix of economic and foreign policy, which I really enjoyed working on those issues. A lot of time spent in the White House Situation Room, which I'd only seen in movies before actually being there. But it was really, I was really grateful to be part of, making those tough decisions, and in my role, doing the research and the fact checking, and then watching and advising as the senior folks decided on recommendations to the president. So I did that for 2 years. And then I moved over to the chief of staff's office, working for the deputy chief of staff, Bruce Reed, who I'd actually met in California several years before, and then worked for him. And unlike on the economic team, where I had a lane, a set of issues, for Bruce, he really ranged across economic policy, domestic policy. He did a lot of work on tech policy, and he was the prime mover in the president's State of the Union address. So both for that speech in 2023 and 2024, I worked a lot with him to coordinate the policy across the entire White House and get ideas from agencies about new policies that the president could announce. And it was really special to see how that speech came together, and to get to go to the State of the Union for both of those years. And the second year, actually standing in the chamber as he delivered the speech. And I think, one other experience that was very special is that being part of that team, we did a lot on technology policy. And so was part of the team that helped coordinate in advance of the president's executive order on artificial intelligence. We hosted a major meeting in the Roosevelt Room where the president stopped in, the vice president led it, with CEOs of some of the major AI firms, including Sam Altman, Dario Amodei from Anthropic, Sundar Pichai from Google, Satya Nadella from Microsoft. And so it was amazing after the launch of ChatGPT to see how government and business, the back and forth discussion between them on how do we address these very novel issues. And then also actually helped organize a roundtable for the president in San Francisco in the summer of 2023. And that was the one time after that was done, went with my boss on the flight back on Air Force One. And so I knew that was a special experience. I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to be there again. And so I made sure to call my mom, call my wife, it was a patchy phone call, but just so that I could tell them. I texted them before. I said, hey, if you get a phone number from a Maryland number, just pick it up. It'll be me trying to reach you.
So great. Nobody who knows you is surprised that you ended up in the White House. You're still young. Let's see, last summer, my daughter, Kyla, won a competition and was out in DC for National History Day. I knew nothing about National History Day. I didn't know my daughter was doing it. Next thing I know, we're in DC because she's won an award, and I get in touch with you and you're like, oh yeah, you know all about National History Day, of course. It was so special for us to be able to get a mini tour of the White House from you. And yeah, spoiler alert, the election didn't turn out how you had hoped. So what are you doing now?
Yeah, and so my wife and I had our first baby right before Election Day. Her name is Lena. So she's now 8.5 months old. And so after the election was done, and I'd moved over from the White House to the campaign at that time, so I was all wrapped up. And so spent a lot of time with the baby, which was, of course, very meaningful and also much healthier than scrolling through the news, trying to figure out what exactly had happened. Although that is also an important exercise. And I think something that Democrats as a whole and all of us who worked in that administration are thinking through, what are the lessons for whatever comes next. And so I think right now we moved back to California in the spring to be near my wife's parents, who she's an only child. So this is their first granddaughter. And so they're having a blast with her. It's nice to be out of DC, given that after the changeover, it's of course going to be a very different vibe over there. And so here I'm a fellow at Stanford at their Economic Policy Institute, trying to do some writing on my own after years of writing internal memos that never see the light of day. In addition to that, I'm advising an AI governance nonprofit that's thinking through key AI issues. I'm doing a couple of other projects on the side, trying to learn as much about AI as possible, and especially the intersection of AI, economic policy, and national security and international policy. I just think those questions are going to be more and more important as we go ahead in the months and years to come. And then finally, from the outside, but doing whatever I can to help Governor Newsom. He's got about 1.5 years left, and I know he's got some decisions to make about what to do after that. But whatever he does, I'll be very supportive of that.
Okay, last overarching question. Uh, as you know, the primary question I ask my guests is what lesson have you learned that you would most like to share? Many academics talk about their research, business leaders about a particular story. But as you think back on your career and thinking about your new child, if you could summarize or pull, not summarize, but pull out a lesson from, this career that we've been talking about. If you could pull out a lesson that you most wanted to share, what would that be?
That's a big question. I guess I would say two things. First, I thought a lot about this when I was applying to the business school, and they asked this question: "What matters most to you and why?" Which is also a very big question. And the answer I came up with, I called it, or the way I'd heard it described, is living an integrated life. And the way that is like a high sounding phrase, but in practice, it simply means think about what you value, think about what you care about, think about what you're interested in, and then try to act in a way that is consistent with all of that. And so I think, and it's a little more practical that way than folks who simply say, follow your passion, follow your dreams. Like that's important too. But I think, sometimes those things work out, sometimes they don't. But I think if every day you're thinking, what is it I actually care about? And then think, am I spending time with people who reflect those values? Am I parenting once you're a parent in a way that reflects those values, or my career choices aligned with that? I think that is by far the most important thing. And I remember Arthur Schlesinger, who I've written my master's thesis about. He said every act of moral courage starts with somebody sitting in a room by himself or herself, just reflecting on what's the right thing to do. And so I think that's a lesson that's always been important to me. Even if a bunch of people are going one way, always think about, well, what is it that I value and how can I act in that way? And then I think the second thing, certainly that I would want to tell my daughter is, and it's something I learned from my parents, is you want to work really hard because nothing worthwhile. It's one of the reasons I love following athletics. It's the same way at sports. It's the same way in the workplace. It's the same way with a hobby or with a relationship. Nothing comes without hard work. But at the same time, you have to understand, and I think all the great religions of the world see this too, that so much of it is outside of your control, and or will work out in ways that you never expected. Sometimes for the better, right? In ways that you wouldn't even dreamed of. What's that old country song? Thank God for unanswered prayers. And so I do think, I think a key part of life that I keep trying to remind myself is you got to work really hard. If you want something, you believe in something, you got to go after it, and you can't get knocked down. But at the same time, that should live side by side with in your mind with, as the Beatles said, let it be. And if you can keep those two things together, I think that's a very healthy way to live.
Well, Vivek, this is so fun for me. This fills in a lot of the gaps. Uh, we spent so much time at Stanford and all those classes together, but there's so much still to learn. I'm grateful I was able to learn what I did from this interview. I'm grateful for the time you gave me. If you remember let's see, it was Professor Weisberg at our graduation. He said something like, we're sad to see you go, but we know we'll see you again. Something like that. You may remember the exact phrase, but uh, it's been fun to follow your career. I could do 100 hours with you because there's so much we could go into. I'm sad the interview's over, but I know I will be seeing you again, and we'll all be excited to follow your career. We're all wondering what Vivek Viswanathan is going to do next. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast today, Vivek.
No, it's been amazing. Thank you.